Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your Saturday so far. Today we're going to talk about the domain and range of quadratic functions. Remember, a quadratic function is a function whose graph is a parabola. That's the U-shaped function that we talked about in class the other day. Let's do a quick review of domain and range. Remember, domain is the set of all x values that's on the graph of a function. So when we're looking for the domain, we're going to be looking across the graph from left to right. The range is the set of all y values on the graph of a function. So when we look at the range, we're going to be looking at the graph from the bottom to the top. We're going to be looking at two different types of parabolas today. We're going to have parabolas with endpoints, which means that both the domain and the range have a definite starting point and a definite ending point. And we're going to write those using interval notation like this. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to look at the domain of this parabola. So that means that we're going to draw lines on the left and on the right of the function. And then we're going to follow those lines down to the x-axis to see where they would intersect. So this one is going to intersect somewhere around about 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. This one here is going to intersect somewhere around 2.6. So that means that our domain is going to start at negative 0.6 and go to 2.6. Let's look at the range. For the range, we're going to draw lines on the bottom and on the top of the graph. And because range is y values, we're going to follow those over to the y-axis to see where the lines intersect. So we can see that our range starts at 2 and goes up to 10. And remember, when you're using this interval notation, you're always starting with the smallest and going to the largest. So you're always going to be using less than signs in the interval notation. You don't have to worry about which direction your signs go. Start with the smallest, go to the largest, always use less than signs. Okay. Let's do an example of a parabola that opens down. So let's look at our domain. It starts at about negative 2, and it looks like it ends at about 4. So our domain goes from negative 2 to positive 4. Okay, let's look at our range, starting at the bottom of the graph and going to the top. So we can see that our range goes from negative 5 up to positive 4. All right, let's look at a parabola that opens up toward the left. So here our domain is going to go from negative 5 to 0. And then our range will go from about negative 1, we'll round, up to positive 3. Okay, make sure that you are taking time to go ahead and box in these functions, because that is really going to help you to see the domain and the range. If you're not boxing them in, then you're going to be likely to mistake the domain and the range and switch those around. If you box them in, you can follow your line down to the x-axis and see what the domain is, and then your range lines, you can follow them over to the y-axis and see what your range is. Okay, let's look at a function that opens to the right. Our domain goes from negative 4 to positive 12. See if you can do the range on your own on this one. Pause the video and then press play to check your work. So you should have found your range going from -1 to positive 7. All right, let's move on to parabolas with arrows. Remember, the arrows mean that the parabola is going to continue in the direction of the arrow. So, if a line would touch an arrow, we are not going to draw the line. We're going to remember that the arrows mean that the parabola continues infinitely in 3 directions. It means that the parabola is getting both longer and wider. So let's look at a couple examples. Okay, so let's look at example number 1. If we were to draw arrows on the left, or if we were to draw lines on the left and right, we can see that our lines would touch arrows on the left and on the right. So we're not going to draw those lines because we know that the parabola is not limited on the left and right. It's going to continue getting wider. So that means that the domain goes from negative infinity all the way out here to positive infinity all the way out here. Another way of writing that is to use the all real numbers symbol. Let's look at our range. Looks like our range is going to start at -1. That's the y value. And on the top, our line would touch arrows. That means that the parabola is going to continue upward to infinity. So we're not going to draw the line. So our range starts at -1 and goes to positive infinity. Another way of writing that would be to say that the range values are all, or the y values are all greater than or equal to -1, because they start at -1 and continue upward. So let's look at a parabola opening downward. You do the domain on this one and then press play to check your answers. Okay, hopefully you noticed that lines on the left and right would touch arrows. So you said parabola is getting wider, which means my domain goes from -infinity to positive infinity. And the domain is all real numbers. Please be familiar with both of these notations. You will see both of them. Okay, you go ahead and do your range. I've already drawn in the top line for you. Then press play to check your answers. Okay, so a line drawn on the bottom would touch arrows, meaning that this continues downward. So we're not going to draw that line. So the range of our parabola would start at -infinity and then go up to 1. So that means that the range is all y values that are less than or equal to 1. All right, here's a parabola opening to the left. So what's going to happen with this? Well, we have arrows on the left, but we do have a stopping point on the right. So let's go ahead and draw a line on the right. Okay, you try to fill in the domain on this one. So your domain should have started at -infinity because we're continuing outward to the left, and it should have ended at 0. Remember, we always start with the lowest values and move toward the highest values. So the domain would be all x values less than or equal to 0. Okay, let's look at our range. This time when we look at the range, we notice that a line drawn on the bottom would touch an arrow, and a line drawn on the top would touch an arrow. So the range has no limits. The parabola is continuing both upward and downward. So our range is going to be from negative infinity to positive infinity, which is all real numbers. Okay, let's look at one more parabola. This one is opening to the right. You go ahead and see if you can do this one completely on your own and then check your answers. Remember not to draw lines wherever they would touch arrows. All right, let's see how you did. Your domain should go from 2 to positive infinity, which would be all x values greater than or equal to 2. You should have noticed that your range would continue both upward and downward. So that means that our range is from negative infinity to infinity, all real numbers. Okay, the next page in your packet is also notes, but we will cover that in class on Monday.